Good morning. Good morning. I have my new room. So the husky right here. Oh, how am I doing that backwards? That is Augie. And the Rhodesian Ridgeback is Otis. I mean, for all intents and purposes, yes.
Yeah. Like,
My partner actually helped me rescue the husky
uh,
from my former neighbor at the place that I used to live. I like lived sort of just above them and over to the side. And in the summer, the first summer that they got him, he was just outside on the back patio. Then he would go to the bathroom and he was just
right.
in his own filth like all day, not wanting to call,
Yeah.
anybody. So I was just like, hey, I'm your neighbor. I work from home. I could use some exercise. And I noticed your dog is like, maybe I could walk them. And then I did that a few times, and would just take him down to the water and just let him cool off. But I was like dropping seeds. I was like, if you ever end up giving him up for adoption, like please keep me in mind. He asked, and I obviously couldn't take him. I was in the same living space, like just that. Our partner was able to take him.
Oh,
I had parakeets as a kid, and then I found out years later that what I thought was one parakeet was actually many parakeets that had been rotated out by my parents because it like escaped or died or it's like, oh my God. I was like making observations like why doesn't so and so sing anymore? Or, like I feel like
that's
I was
good.
gaslit a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
Born before I was born. So they made sure I fully was exposed to death, and something that was very unique, and because it's a reality,
It
you know.
is. Yeah.
You see roadkill. I saw meat.
So actually this is reminding me a lot of we didn't get into this in this class, but given that we were just talking about religious diversity last week and we're talking about, non-Western perspectives and non-traditional patriarchal perspectives this week, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about are common and significant themes in the story of Siddhartha Gautama and how he achieved enlightenment and became the Buddha, right? So he grew up very sheltered, right? Sheltered in this life of privilege. He was a prince, right, in the Hindu tradition. And it wasn't until he was in his early 20s that he finally ventured outside of the palace grounds and was able to experience like basic elements of suffering in life, like the fact that people get sick. He was protected from that, right? The fact that people get old, right? He was only ever surrounded by young, healthy, beautiful people. And the fact that people die. And so it was upon realizing these three things and specifically realizing that no amount of wealth or privilege could protect you from those, right? That all of these things that he had grown up to think are the most valuable, right? Beauty, health, youth, these things are all temporary, right? And so trying to hold on to them, trying to make them last forever, and making them so special is actually the root of all of our suffering, right? So like realizing these things in such a like that sort of
Short
cycle
time.
of not having access to it until much later in life was very dramatic for him. But then I've seen examples of the flip side. In hearing some of you share your stories, I was thinking about, David, it was when you were talking about your parents telling you which animals are for eating and which animal, right? There's a really sweet video that I show in my environmental animal ethics class when we talk about animal rights. And it's a video of a little boy and his mother. This is like, I think early internet days, but it's just his mother, videotaping him as he's eating octopus. And he's having a conversation with her. And through the conversation, which is like, very Socratic and very philosophical, he comes to realize that in order for him to be able to eat it, the animal has to be dead. And so then he starts to make the connection between all of the different meats that he eats and all of the different animals that have to die for him to be able to eat them. And like in this beautiful epiphany, he says that he doesn't want to eat the animals anymore. And his mom starts crying and he says, did I do something beautiful? It was so cute, right?
So
This
my
sort of natural, instinctual, as soon as we allow the connection to be made, instead of forcing that compartmentalization, right? that empathy that we have to extend it then. And then, the pigs that we think are so cute make us not want to eat the bacon, as delicious as the bacon is, right? So yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah.
interesting philosophical, that's why, like, I mean, for many years, the
Yeah.
years when I teach environmental ethics, because I feel like a hypocrite.
Yeah.
um I was vegan, right? Or
Yeah.
vegetarian, or trying to be, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're human, we mess up. But yeah, there's the biggest benefit I got from doing that was not feeling guilty, because like I still, when I do it, I know it's wrong. Like I'm choosing to do the wrong thing anyways for egoistic reasons. But the truth is that, vegans and vegetarians can save anywhere between 75 and 100 animals per year based on the average amount of meat that we consume in a Western diet. Like,
Mhm.
so just like in terms of individual impact, it can mean a lot. Um, and then of course there's, the larger symbolic thing, although that's tough, especially again if you're the philosopher of your family or friend group, right? Then you're the one explaining to like other people's kids why you don't eat the animals, and then you're making them look like assholes. Right? They're like, why don't you eat the animal? Because I love them, right? Like, sort of implying that nobody else does. Like, I don't know what to say. Ask them to defend why they do eat it, right? Like, why is that the norm? But these sorts of things are actually a lot of the things that these sort of instincts, these critical instincts, are very much in the spirit of what we're talking about today, right? What the rest of the content was for this week, which are we're classifying as feminist critiques of philosophy of religion. But I do want to clarify that feminism, right, does not necessarily correspond to anyone's personal gender or sexual identity, right? So regardless of your sexual or gender identity, you could or could not identify as or be a feminist, right? And so then the question is, what is a feminist? Okay, there's lots of different opinions about this. So just like in philosophy, right, there's no one clear definition, right? Feminism is an umbrella term, right? It captures a lot of different views. So there are no two feminists who are exactly the same, right? There's so much diversity of thought. But there are two necessary and sufficient criteria, philosophically speaking, to be considered a feminist. Okay. And so one of these things is regarding a descriptive claim, right? Something about the way the world is or the way things are. And the other involves a commitment to a normative claim, which is about the way things ought to be. Okay, so in other words, in order to count as a feminist, you have to at least be committed to these two things, right? And then anything else is like extra icing on the cake, right? But many people, especially today, throughout human history, right? Many people do not ascribe to both of these things. They either ascribe to one and not the other, or they ascribe to neither. Okay, so we're going to talk about each of these. But let's talk about what these claims are. So the descriptive claim that you must be committed to be considered quote unquote a feminist, is that there are, or I should say there has been, and continue to be, elements or instances of discrimination based on people's identity to a single group or to a particular group. Now, originally, yes, feminism did begin as a focus on women's issues, quote unquote. The term femme in French, right, refers to woman. That's what the root of the word is. And ism is a political stance, right? So it was a political stance about women, right, that would make you a feminist in that specific regard. But as all philosophical ideals, hopefully, it tries to improve itself, right? So through a lot of critical self-reflection and external critique, very justly warranted, it was realized that early feminism was not really concerned with all women. It was really concerned with upper middle class married women, right? And then slowly expanding to single women, right? Still pretty white, still pretty upper middle class, right? Slowly expanding to include women of color, women at lower socioeconomic levels, right? Women outside of the United States, then starting to be concerned with people who are marginalized by a patriarchal system who are not women, right? So including marginalized masculine identities, marginalized identities outside of the binary, right? So people who are trans, intersex, people who are identify as maybe fluid, right? So they have maybe a third pronoun that they go by, right? Maybe you've heard some of these. Z or zer is a common one, right? In the European or Romantic languages, they've started to replace, Mr. or Mrs. with mix, right? So you can add the X to indicate a non-binary or third gender, right? So there's lots of different identities that have come to be championed or, tried to be represented for by feminism. But feminism has been around a long time now, so it's included a lot more even than just human suffering and discrimination, actually, some of the things we were just talking about. A lot of feminists have now included animal rights into their respective areas of concern because they see that a lot of the arguments used to justify poor treatment of animals are very similar right, to the same arguments used to justify poor treatment of other human beings, right? And so if we're refuting those arguments over here, then we should be addressing them over here. Right. And this leads us into the most inclusive current form of feminism, which is most commonly known as ecofeminism, which is taking in not just all human, but other sentient beings. So including, again, even in the human realm, addressing ageism, right? Any forms of discrimination based on identity, again, non-human animals, and then even extending that to the environment, right? Seeing environmental issues as an extension of feminist issues, right? So you'll see a lot of, when we're going to see this when we talk about philosophy of religion in relationship to feminism, there's going to be a lot of assessment of language that's used, right? And the implication of that language. And so specifically the critique is that language has historically and continues to be androcentric, right? So focusing on the males, right? So humanity, right? Saying things like mankind, or presuming that you might notice that a lot of people will qualify if they have a woman doctor or a female doctor, right? And if they have a man, they'll just say doctor. Or if you don't make a gendered qualifier, people will usually just presume gender, right, based on certain stereotypes about jobs and inherent characteristics apparently that make, maybe biological women, biological females who identify as women, like particularly good at nurturing and caregiving, right? Like, and we have these very, very traditional gendered expectations, but the idea is that that comes from the words that we use, right? Sort of self-fulfilling prophecy about language. And so that critique of language, again, even extends to the way that people have historically talked about the environment, right? Talking about, venturing into unknown, exploring exotic. It's almost sexual sometimes, the way that, early European colonizers, right, describe discovering new lands, right? So again, extending the critiques based on the fact that they're similar, right? So the idea, again, is that even though feminism was rooted in this very niche area of critique, right, it's extended that to any discrimination, right, based on membership in a certain group. Okay, so the descriptive claim of feminism, again, is that there has been this type of discrimination and there continues to be. Okay, so it's a claim about the way things are and the way things have been. So at bare minimum, right, to be considered a feminist, you have to acknowledge that there has been discriminatory practices based on people's gender, based on people's race, based on people's age, right? Whatever the issue is, that such discrimination has taken place and continues to take place. Okay, so just a description about the way things have been and the way things are. The second claim is the normative claim. Again, this is about the way things ought to be, right? So this is a commitment, right, to a sort of ideal, which is that the kinds of discrimination we were just talking about should not take place, right? So what this means is that it's really easy not to be a feminist because you could say, oh, sure, I agree that, people ought to be treated equally. I just think they already are, right? There's a lot of that sort of anti-feminism out there, right? Pretending to be, championing equality while not actually acknowledging any existence of inequity to begin with. Okay. And then, of course, the latter, which is much less common, but unfortunately getting more and more loud in our day and age, which is you could say, oh, sure, people are unequal. Like, yeah, I'm willing to admit that, but I think that's how it ought to be, right? Again, we are living in a world where those voices are unfortunately getting louder and more powerful. So that's different ways of being anti-feminist. Again, you just have to deny one. You don't have to deny both claims. Okay, just denying one is sufficient to be extremely dangerous, as we have come to see in this world. All right, so the content this week in your two PowerPoints so in that feminist philosophy of religion section, you have two PowerPoints, like an intro, and then the one that's actually called Feminist Philosophy of Religion. I just wanted to note that it's that second PowerPoint that has more content that will be on the quiz. So in terms of what to focus on when you're taking the quiz for this week. There's like a lot of stuff about logical positivism in the first PowerPoint, which is really interesting, but I'm not quizzing you on that. So don't stress yourself out about those details. Logical positivism is really important philosophically speaking. It can take us back to earlier conversations we've had in this class, like when we were doing the argument for miracles or, arguments for God's existence. And this has to do with when we are trying to establish the truth of a proposition, right, whatever it is, that God exists, that God has a certain characteristic, that we have a soul, right, whatever our theological claim is, the idea is that those statements are only meaningful, like hopefully you guys learned about the difference between syntax and semantics, right? So like you can teach a computer the syntax, right? But teaching it the meaning of something is a little bit different, right? So I can teach you like the letters of apple, but it's different to actually know what an apple is, right? The meaning of the word, that's the semantics of it, right? And so the idea here is that without evidential proof, without showing us the apple, we can't have that. It has no meaning, right? It's just the letters that we assign it. And so logical positivism ends up being a form of skepticism, right? Pretty radical skepticism in terms of religion, right? Because so few of our religious propositions are able to be confirmed with empirical evidence, right? So you'll see a lot of discussion of scientific terms here, like falsifiability, right? This is an important criteria when you learn about the history of science and how we've gotten to our current empirical standards today. Now, what's important to note is that a lot of scientists will hold by this, right? They will say that in order for something to be a meaningful theory, right, it has to be falsifiable. We have to be able to prove it wrong, right? But what's weird is that there's a lot of theories that we like that are not falsifiable, like the theory of evolution. It turns out that whatever survives, oh yeah, guess what? That must have been the fittest, right? Or that must have been the most cooperative. Well, if it died, it must not have, right? If it went extinct, it must not have been adapted to its environment. You can't really prove it wrong, right? But we still find the theory to be one of the most plausible and empirically, what the term is in philosophy of science is it has the most explanatory power, right? Which is what we like from scientific theories. So again, that's philosophy of science. There's a lot of interesting stuff there to apply to the philosophy of religion conversation. It's good to have an awareness of those critiques. But again, I'm not going to be quizzing you on the details of that, right? So the main critiques and thing to focus on are that second PowerPoint, which is again, this is a little bit easier to go through because it also focuses on some key terms, right? So hopefully you've had a chance to go through some of these, but hopefully, again, you've maybe come across some of these already. A lot of them are new, but has anyone heard the word patriarchy before? David, what do you understand the word patriarchy to refer to? Excellent.
Or leadership role.
Excellent, right? So this does involve a particular type of power structure, like you said, which we understand typically as a hierarchy, right? So we often depict that in the form of a pyramid, right? Hierarchical systems have fewer people at the top, right? with more people at the bottom, and there's an inverse relationship, right, between your level in the system and how much power you have, right? And so exactly like you said, at the root of the word, right, patriarchy, or like in the sense of androcentrism, right? There's a couple different words historically that are refer to the male gender, right, in different ways. But in this sense, yeah, father meaning at the top, right, the head of the pyramid. So yeah, patriarchy is male dominated, right? So this is a generalization though, right? This does not mean that it's only ever men in power, right? But what it means is that the people in power will always uphold a certain type of traditional masculinity, right? And so what we tend to see is a very homogenous group of people at the top in terms of their presentation often. But if you even are able to find diversity up there, right, you're probably not going to be able to see that in terms of ideology, right? Very homogenous in terms of maintaining the current system, the current status quo for the people who have the most power, right? With the majority of people being at the bottom. And these are going to be, again, inverse in terms of their embodiment of traditional masculine ideals, right? So the people who are, we call this marginalized, right? Pushed to the margins, right? Of society, of power, right? Of conversation, of history, of everything, right? That these marginalized groups, again, historically, the focus was on a very small number of them, but we've come to realize that it's actually quite an extensive group that has been marginalized. Basically, anyone who is not upper middle class, Christian, heterosexual, male, I'm probably physically abled. What else?
White.
White. Did I not say white? That should have
Uh,
been the first thing out of my mouth.
yeah.
Yeah. White, white, white. Yeah. Right. Again, so all of the isms that you could think of, right? The idea is that the epitome of that, basically the person that, Hitler would have a wet dream over or something, that ideal person, right? Whoever embodies those ideals the most, right? That's going to be the people that are going to be rewarded the most from that system, right? So they will trickle, if there's any trickling up, that's that's it, right? But everyone else is marginalized and pushed down, right? Because they represent everything that is antithetical, right? So, and this is a problem that feminists rightly critique is actually at the root of a lot of historical philosophy, right? And so a common feminist critique is something that we talked about on Tuesday, which is a critique we also see from Western traditions. I'm sorry, from Eastern traditions of Western traditions. And that is the critique of dualism, right? Presuming that everything comes in two opposing forces, right? And so feminists obviously have a lot to gain from similar types of critique, right? Not identifying only two types of gender, only two types of, white or non-white, Christian or not, or pagan, good or evil, right? Rich or poor, criminal or citizen, right? Legal or illegal, right? All the bullshit that people are trying to constantly push in your faces. It's just this or this. These are your only two options. Pick one, right? The feminist critique is that that is a false dilemma to begin with, right? So those critiques of dualism, we're going to see similar critiques, right? But from a feminist perspective, right? Aimed at addressing inequalities, both in the past and trying to prevent, right? Future continuation of these sorts of inequities. So we can probably imagine, right, that in terms of philosophy of religion, the patriarchy is, alive and well. Every major world religion has been patriarchal historically. You're not in my major world religions class, so you haven't seen this firsthand, but you can take it with me. And you can review content on my website. But even the most generous towards femininity, Eastern traditions like Taoism, even still in practice, because they existed in patriarchal societies, they never got to really embody any sort of equity. And so we see this unfortunately, in terms of a lot of the mystical traditions I sort of referenced the other day as well. You'll see a lot of those championing like using of sexuality as a way of enlightenment, right? Which can, of course, historically be great for women because that's historically been the thing held most against them, right? Typically seen as a threat to men, right? Like the one bit of power females have over males, right? So you better lock that shit down in marriage real soon, right? Guys got to control that. Can't be using that power over everybody, right? Scary. Scary. Okay, so that thing that is historically a sin for females is now a path to enlightenment in Eastern traditions. And you can see, unfortunately, how easy that is for exploitation, right? And so you end up with these male gurus who are just having sex with everybody, right? Supposedly for their own betterment. So again, in practice, right, even the most charitable towards femininity, when they exist in these patriarchal societies, it's really difficult to separate, right? Even more equitable ideology from actual exploitation in the world. So it's important to acknowledge these critiques, and especially in this day and age when we look at how many people are fleeing institutionalized religions and moving towards more individualized spiritualities and things like this. It's like the ripest of times for cults to emerge. And they don't even have to be the types of cults that, we see documentaries about, right? I mean, you can even look at some of the goop capitalist, economic incentives and not incentives, but initiatives, I should say, that are out there, right? That they are targeting women, right, who have historically been ignored by people in authority, right? Their pain has not been taken seriously. So guess what? We hear you, right? We are listening. Your pain is real. Unfortunately, we're going to give you this drug that was never FDA approved, right? Or we're going to recommend a caffeine enema that's going to burn your insides out, right? Like for $3,000. So again, even though it's wrapped in a nice feminist critique bow, we want to be careful. That does not necessarily mean that whatever the solution is going against the current status quo, right? So it's important to understand the critiques, but it doesn't mean that whatever is floating behind that critique is necessarily identifying with it. So feminism can be weaponized like anything else, right? We gotta be careful with religious authority. We gotta be careful with political authority, right? And so the similar messaging goes. Okay, so I've been talking for a little while. There's tons of information in the PowerPoint, but let's do questions. I'm sure you guys have questions about feminism or feminism in terms of religion. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, and while I do, I'm gonna give you another little peek at my doggies. Hi, Elgie. That's not a satisfactory answer. No, her response comes from, and this is actually, I'm gonna just use my experience from having studied the world religions and studied them specifically from a feminist perspective after learning about them the regular way, right? Without any feminist lens or critique. And that is, I've gone through a series of phases in my attitude towards religion in general, right? Given this common trend. But what's important to note is that it hasn't always been as sexist or as misogynistic, right, as we might view it currently, right? And so if you go back and you learn about early religious traditions, you will learn that the earliest forms of religion heavily worshipped the feminine, right? And so this was some of the newer spiritualities or neo-pagan or new age traditions. But what's amazing is that when you look at the connection between, again, this is a feminist lens, right? Historically, you wouldn't always look at the connection between politics and religion when doing theological work, right? But a feminist would, right? They're going to look at all the context. And what they would note is that it's at these moments of colonial or imperial invasion that we start to see a direct attack on feminine worship, as well as that happens to coincide with a greater gap between what we might call traditional gender roles, right? So if you go back to early Islam, women had far more rights, right, than they do under current Islamic theology, right? Because they're taking later written works into account, right? So what we see is that when a dip in the treatment of women started to occur, or the treatment of people who were outside of the binary, right? So third genders, which have existed, have always existed, right? That's like a revisionist history, right? To pretend like it's a new thing, right? So these traditions have, but there's been an active effort to erase it, right? Once a new power comes in, right? So destroying temples, destroying scripture, destroying elements of worship, right? Making it illegal, killing people who don't propagate the one true religion. So once you see that that hasn't always been the case, right? A theist, right, might then credit the patriarchal and misogynistic patterns we see throughout the majority of human history, right, as more of a human fallibility error, right, and not necessarily something inherent in God, right? Because something you'll notice again, very much from the Eastern traditions, is when you look back to ages before in religious traditions, there's often the sense that the earlier you go back, the better we were as human beings. Have you noticed that? Right? Like there was something closer to our true nature the further you go back in human time. And so there's something about that that we're often trying to recapture, right? And so if we acknowledge that the earliest times were worshiping the feminine, right, then a feminist who is a theist could very easily say, like, yeah, this history of misogyny doesn't, take away from the fact that humans first interactions with the divine interpreted it in a feminine way, right? Or embodied it with feminine characteristics. And that is meaningful, right? And we want to try to return to that, or at least go to something that is more gender neutral, right? To avoid some of the inequities that we've seen. So that's, I think, the more charitable version, right? Which is to say that this is a decline that we see connected to political invasions, right? And there's a word for it now that we wouldn't have had historically, which is punching down, right? So when people tend to lose power outside of the home in a political context, they will tend to take that out in their home, right, on people they feel they still have power over, right? This is like the root of bullying and domestic violence and, right, intimate partner violence and abuse and things like this. So yeah, it's the idea for the feminist is that all of that is connected, right? And we should take all of that into consideration. It's not just that there's only been men in charge, although that's certainly problematic, right? And there have, of course, been religious traditions, especially today, who are making drastic efforts to try to change that. But yeah, on the whole, male dominated. It's just factually accurate. Great question. So what you have touched upon, sorry, I'm trying to spell while I talk, is the split. And of course, it's philosophy, so there are people. Oh, I'm sorry, my cat is out here with the dogs. This is huge. They're sleeping. Are you being so brave? Do you want to come right under the blanket? Sorry, we're having a moment. Okay, so while this amazing thing's happening, and you've picked up on this amazing discussion, the traditional idea, and this is again traditional according to mostly white men in the West who have been considered the canon of philosophy, they take what is called an analytic approach. And this is the kind of program I was trained in, right? When this is the idea is that to be logical and to be objective, we need to separate the person from the argument, right? And so this is why in, a human rights class, you'll read, of course, Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., but you'll probably also read some Mein Kampf and right, some literary figures that are obviously morally questionable. But the idea is that, just because the idea is based in what is a commonly known fallacy as the ad hominem fallacy, right? Which is that just because a claim comes from a certain person doesn't necessarily mean it's false, right? So, right, even, let's say you hate 47, right? And you think even if you're like, I have sufficient evidence that this person is a compulsive liar, right? That doesn't mean that every single word or phrase that comes out of their mouth is false, right? So a statement could still be true. The idea is that we can't just tell based on that person. We need to go look for other evidence, right? To more credible sources to determine it, right? So the analytic tradition takes that approach, right? That it's a logical fallacy to actually consider, right, some things about the person because that might wind up giving us biases. Now, what is historically known as the continental approach, which of course then is like very haughtily like looked down upon by the analytic tradition, it's so bad. Feminists would have historically been thrown into the continental approach. This is the idea that no, we absolutely need to take the person into consideration when assessing their argument, right? And so they go through the history of philosophy and the sciences, right? In every field of academia, you can find a feminist, branch, right? Where they're going back and saying, hold on a second, before we just accept these guys' theories, right? Which have implied that, maybe women's brains are smaller or that African Americans' bones aren't as strong, so they can't be astronauts. Like all of this bad science, right? That we've just taken as fact. Hold on, let's go back through and let's make sure that they were actually abiding by the standards that we uphold in the scientific method, right? And what they discovered is that all kinds of biases leak in, right? To all of the best, most valuable and most rigorous methods we have. And so they even come to challenge the notion of objectivity, right? And so the idea is that you always have to take the person into consideration, right? You always have to take the social political context into consideration. And this specific view in feminism, and this is part of the PowerPoint, is called standpoint theory or standpoint epistemology. Okay, and so this is the idea that knowledge, right, is only acquired relative to a knower's standpoint. Okay, and again, just like we talked about in terms of non-Western philosophy, the knower does not exist in a vacuum. Right? So the knower is a communal, a situated agent, right, with all sorts of contexts, and so that needs to play into account, right, for our theorizing. So how does that look in terms of religion? Well, again, historically, women have been associated with their bodies. Bodies have not necessarily been seen as conducive to arriving at religious knowledge, right? Typically, historically, bodies are seen as sinful, right? They get in the way of our ability to have a relationship with the divine, right? To go beyond the physical. Okay. And so if women are associated with their bodies, that means we tend to not be associated with the qualities that one needs to have a relationship with the divine, let alone be worthy of, any sort of moral praise. So you can see then the like falling into, association with all things negative, right? And so I actually have a gig page. Did I include this? I did not. So I gave you the gig introduction to feminisms, and it's linked at the bottom, but I'll also share the link in the chat. I have a gig page on standpoint theory with a nice little version of that hierarchy. So I give you like the regular one, and then I give you the inverse of what the feminist is talking about. Okay, so to kind of go along with that picture. Right, so this is down towards the bottom. Yes, so contemporary concepts, standpoint theory, and then you have those two pyramids, right? And so traditional theories of knowledge, according to feminists, right, what we can know, they say absolutely it's tied to who you are, right? Women haven't been granted any sort of knowledge, right? We get instincts or something like this, right? We don't get to be considered authorities on anything except maybe emotions, stuff like that, right? So absolutely, they think it's been tied to stuff. But again, there are still a lot of analytic philosophers, they'll say like analytic to the core, right? And so when they say that, what they're saying is they don't think that that has anything to do with assessing arguments, right? Their strength. We don't necessarily need to take a person's personal details into account, politics. And furthermore, that even if we did, it wouldn't necessarily like bear any fruit or give us reason to reject it. Other questions? All right. So again, What we're going over this week is really just a cursory view at what are large umbrellas of other areas of philosophy, right? So I hope this is piquing your interest in other things that you'd like to continue to explore. But this is the last day that our class is meeting. Next week is finals week. So in case I don't get to see you all again, it's been wonderful having this class with you. And thanks very much. Thanks so much for hanging in there till the end. I can answer for anybody before I let you all go for what I hope is a very nice summer, a safe summer. Please, yay, I hope to see you again. I don't do the face-to-face over the summer, but if I always do some hybrids on the fall, winter, and spring. So yeah, please, if you take more classes with me or if you take more philosophy, you might consider getting a philosophy concentration, which is just a little box that you check off when you are getting your AA degree. And it's something that can set you apart when you're transferring, right? Like when you have like certificates or extra things, you can be like, oh yeah, I specialized my humanities electives in philosophy. So that can look really good. But yeah, it's something to consider if you're already thinking of taking another philosophy class, because then you're like halfway there.